Welcome back, everyone. Another Monday, another video. Today we're going to talk about something I call back pressure decay in sociotechnical systems. This is one of those things where if you're not paying attention to something that seems very unrelated, it can cause a snowball effect and a chain of cause and effect that impacts something seemingly unrelated, such as developers not shipping their code on time, snowballs into we have to change our corporate strategy. So I'm going to walk you through how that happens, why that happens, how to stop it, and what to look for. So stick around and we're going to have some fun. In many of your companies, you're going to have somebody somewhere start off with the big mission, right? So you have a big mission, we're going to change the world or something to this very large magnitude. The better defined it is, the better your company is. And usually that precipitates some sort of long-term goal, a North Star, a strategy, some description of where we want to go directionally. And usually that North Star, to achieve it, you need some conceptual model. A way, some people like to call that a domain model. It's a way that you can think about your business, the way it's modeled, the interactions of things, hypothetical entities that exist within it. This ends up precipitating into the kinds of products that you have, the way you talk about things, the way you split your software teams. But in general, you have some kind of model. And from that model, you end up with two things, right? You'll end up with the architecture and you'll end up with an organizational structure. And for those of you who like Conway's Law, you'll find out it might actually be the same thing. So your architecture is, how do I implement those concepts in a world that's constrained, right? Architecture is almost a way of picking the right set of constraints and the right set of things to grow into in a way that you are able to solve the problems in your conceptual space. And I'm not using the word domain strictly, even though it's very close to what I mean, just because we might be talking about things that are even beyond what a domain is discussing. In general, you're going to have an architecture that helps you execute on implementing that concept. And you're going to have an org structure that helps you get that architecture built out, services that concept. And that org structure might go well beyond product and engineering, and it should go well beyond that. It should explain, how are we implementing our sales team, our marketing team? How is that end-to-end integrated so that we actually sell something? And then all those things kind of cohese together and come into a plan, saying, okay, we have a mission, we have a North Star, there's a concept of how it works. We're going to build something that looks like this. That's our org structure. That's the plan of how we're going to evolve towards it in some way, right? There's a plan that says we're going to do something. Now your plan might be highly detailed, near term, fuzzy detail, long term. Maybe you fall into a bunch of planning fallacies. Maybe you have very poor planning, but generally you take one step after the other and you adapt as you go. And 99% of the time, all that stuff comes into code. Right? And so code is almost the artifact that is the thing created by your architecture, your org chart, in pursuit of your plan to serve the conceptual model, to make you increment closer to your North Star so you can win that mission. And code's not the only thing, right? There's other things your organization can create. Knowledge bases, marketing collateral, other kinds of things like this as well exist. Now, this is a very typical, deeply oversimplified system, and you could actually draw a box around that. And you could say, this is a socio-technical system. Now, this diagram missing something, which is actually showing how those systems interact on the other things. And I think this is the common thing that a lot of people have a misunderstanding with, is they perceive this direct flow from the big mission impacts the North Star, impacts the concept, impacts those things, and it cascades in a unidirectional model. There's no back pressure, there's no backflow. But we know that's not true. And I'm going to walk you through that. And in a socio-technical system, you must consider the interactions into the other directions, the missing arrows in this diagram. Now, if you wanted to make this a complete diagram, you should actually draw arrows fully connected to every single node in all directions, because everything actually influences everything else. And I'm going to demonstrate that to you right now. So if you think about this, this is the very typical thing. So when I talk about back pressure, let's think about that for a second. What does back pressure mean, right? So you're pushing and pushing and pushing, and something's pushing back in the system. And it's causing, as I called it in the beginning, back pressure decay. So we actually have back pressure that's causing decay in our socio-technical system, and it's decaying things that it shouldn't be decaying. It's decaying the quality, the integrity, the cohesion of those other components. Let's remove all those lines for just a moment and think about just the components here. Very common trap that many companies and teams fall into is saying, one part of this thing cannot be touched. Actually, usually they'll say multiple parts of this can never be touched. and this is a big mistake, and I'll walk you through that very soon after I first walk you through this one. Let's look at the plan. Many people make the tactical error in their planning and say our plan in our company is sacrosanct. You cannot change the plan in many companies, right? The penalties for changing a plan are quite high, not just on a personal level, you don't get your big promotion, you're not seen as a competent leader, etc., etc., all these typical problems you can expect. But there's even other things such as our whole company's not able to execute on this, and that's because you have many teams that are tightly bound together, and you have this waterfall thing where one team impacts another team, impacts another team. You have a chain reaction of failure throughout your company because there's so many dependency lines and so many handovers. Nobody's able to actually have the independence to ship something. So this is something that a lot of companies fall into, right? They say the plan is the plan, you must not fail. And so they put up this border around it and say you can't adopt that. This creates, in this moment, we've now created the back pressure. And so that back pressure, right? Let's say we have some code, I'm working away on my code, and I say it's gonna take longer than expected. I estimated it, it went to the plan, it said it would take a week. Turns out it's gonna take 3 weeks. This is a very typical situation. If you've never run into this in a software team, you're either exceptionally lucky or you're literally not looking at what's going on around you. This is such a common situation that it's happening on a daily basis, multiple times in every company. This is an exceptionally common issue. That code that I wrote doesn't fit into the plan. What do we do? Can't change the plan. What's going to happen here? And if you've been around before, you know where this is going, right? This is, we're going to use hacks. We're going to use workarounds. What a lot of people call tech debt. And I don't like the word tech debt because the company did not acquire a debt on the balance sheet. What they did is they spent money on operational expenses and they acquired an asset that's not very good. They did not take out a loan from a bank, right? There's no debt involved. I understand the metaphor. I just think it's not conforming to what you would expect when you're reading a balance sheet. So I just avoid using it because I need to talk to people who look at balance sheets. And when I need to say there's a debt and it ends up being that there is no debt on the balance sheet, I have to go back and re-explain this thing again. So I find a better way to explain that, such as the quality of our software is degraded, right? So the software quality is degraded, which has knock-on impacts such as operational expense of running my dev team is going to grow per unit that they output, whatever that unit is. Doesn't matter. It's going to take longer to do that next batch. So now we have this code with a degraded quality. And I think that code is pretty resilient. Like it's not going to be like, oh, that first piece of substandard hacks and workaround is the straw that broke the camel's back. No, when does the straw break the camel's back? At some point, it's too much. At some point, you degrade the quality beyond the point of, we don't notice it to this is a real problem. You can coast for a while without looking at it, but that ramp comes really fast and it comes at the least convenient time. And then it hits you, right? And at that point in time, now we end up with a place where our architectural concept has drifted from our code. So now we have a code architecture gap, where actually the gap is the architectural concept is misleading and does not explain what the code does or how it works. And the code does not reflect our software architecture. And so this ends up being the architecture becomes somewhat meaningless and you've removed the rules, which accelerates the degradation of quality of your software. And at some point of pressure into your architecture being not useful and your code not following an architecture and your architecture not enforcing code standards, our software architecture does not support your conceptual model of how your business works anymore. And you can run into that problem a lot. And I think we've seen that too, which is our business needs to do this very industry standard thing. And when you want to go and get that done, we can't do that because there's so much tech debt. We can never pivot this software to handle that case. We could have done that 2 years ago if we had the foresight for this, if we had higher quality standards, but it's going to take a lot of work. We're going to have to do a huge code rewrite to make this thing work properly. And so your conceptual model is not supported by our architecture. So I don't know what you're going to do here. It's just really going to be expensive. We can push through, we can put in more hacks, but it's just slow and expensive. And you accept that. And that creates more back pressure up to, okay, well, that North Star is not moving anymore. So now in your pursuit of your North Star, your attempt to proceed and march towards it. You can't do that with your conceptual model because your architecture doesn't work, because your code can't be changed, because we couldn't change the plan. So we couldn't write the good code that we needed. So we couldn't make our architecture work. So we couldn't make the conceptual model work. And so now we're not moving towards our North Star with the velocity that we're hoping to be moving towards it. And that creates multiple back pressures, actually. So first of all, the most typical thing that I see out there is, well, let's see if we can fix that by shuffling people around. We're going to put more people on that problem because it's more expensive to work on that. We're going to try to optimize the organization, throw more people at this because this North Star is really important. We have to get this thing done. And so now our org structure, which was in a certain shape, is rapidly destabilized. Everything's changed in the flip of a hat. That whole team is no longer cohesive, deeply knowledgeable, excelling. They have to retrain, learn new pieces of the system. Takes time to retool, re-educate themselves. Whether or not you've accounted for it, that work has to get done. And then that ends up doing something really, really funny, which is change the plan anyway to accommodate the organizational changes. We're still going to try to, hit that deadline or hit the renegotiated deadline for whatever we wanted to do. But now we have to figure out how do we make that work when we've put 10 more teams on this, which might have been the wrong thing to do. Books like The Mythical Man Month have discussed for a very long time, adding people late to a project most of the time slows it down. It takes 9 months to make a baby. Putting 9 women on that task does not give you a 1-month baby. Right? That's not how that works. This usually creates more chaos in the organization. And in that org shift, you also typically experience a loss of knowledge or a misunderstanding and a miscommunication as everyone's being shuffled around, rapidly onboarded and offboarded on topics. People who were experts on one thing go to something else. That expert knowledge churns, employees leave the company, new people come in, and that deep knowledge kind of evaporates underneath your hands. Your conceptual model is obfuscated inside of your own company, right? The people inside the company who need to know what that thing is, they have lost the collective knowledge to do work on that thing well because they've forgotten what parts they maintain. They don't know what's working and how. And so now they're in a little bit of a chaos and they're relearning stuff, which is going to cost you more, right? That's not going to be fast. They have to retrain on that stuff. They have to rediscover things that other people already knew. You end up with this conceptual model that's not understood. Everyone's a little bit afraid to touch it. And then that creates more back pressure. And our approach towards that North Star is actually even slower because we're now operating on an unsupported and obfuscated conceptual model where we don't know what it is and how it works. So our progress towards that North Star is even slower. Even if we throw more and more people at this thing, it's not helping because the deep knowledge in the company it's not stable enough to build that deep knowledge to get this work done. And that ends up creating another back pressure. Enough is enough. We're not making progress on the North Star. It's too hard. So our big mission is going to gain a sibling big mission. And that other big mission is we have to grow our revenues. We have to grow our profits somehow in this company. So we have to go looking outwards at other horizons to chase. Congratulations. We now have an undeserved diluted mission. And it's undeserved. So in really big companies, you can have a deserved diluted mission where you can go after multiple things at once. So your Google's, Salesforce, what does Google actually do? Like they do way more than web search. They do way more than advertisement, all these big companies, but they can support that kind of complexity. Most companies that are valued under 2 billion pounds, euros, dollars, I don't care. You probably should not have a diluted mission that goes after multiple fronts. There might be exceptions out there, like if your market size isn't in the scale of billions, or you want to pivot from one industry to another, like your Netflix, and you're working on, mailing DVDs, and then you pivot towards being an online streaming platform. That makes sense. But most of the time, you don't deserve this complexity. It's a coping mechanism because you're failing at your existing mission because all the stuff underneath the hood's not working. And in that case, you're not doing the work that you need to do. You're running away from the problem and looking for a new horizon that hopefully is easier. And that ends up creating a back pressure. And so that back pressure is, let's put a North Star next to our North Star. Most of the time, we're not going to give up that first North Star. So now we have 2 North Stars. So one's over there and one's over there. And now your teams are chasing both. So now we have mixed messages inside of our company about, are we chasing DVD sales or are we chasing streaming subscribers? Those might not be cohesive things that synergize and support each other. And that creates another back pressure through the system, right? So now we've split up the focus. We have to accommodate those two North Stars through our organization. So now we have a destabilized org that's lost all their knowledge of things that are important, and they've become unfocused, right? We're going to have to say, well, we have a second North Star. It's really important. We think we're going to move on this. So now we have to allocate some of our people to that and some of our people to maintaining our existing business. And our existing business is really complex, really hard to change because it's super slow, super expensive to make changes there. And so you're not really solving that problem, but you're actually siphoning off resources that could be fixing it and putting it onto something else. But those people, more often than not, are there to get results as fast as possible. And your existing concepts and your existing architecture usually have some legs in them. One of the funniest, most common tropes I see, if you're a salesperson, listen, we sell our product to this kind of customer, this kind of target customer. And then you look over a little bit to the right and you see, oh, there's another customer that's not our target customer, nothing to do with our business, not who we sell to, but you perceive the software as being a bunch of minor tweaks and changes to the existing stuff and say, it's very similar. We're a taxi company like Uber. A pizza delivery company is basically the same thing. We still have taxis, they have cars, we have deliveries and routing systems. It's the same thing. And then you get into it and you find out it's not the same thing, right? But you are so tempted, it's almost impossible to avoid this desire to leverage what's already there and look for a quick win. I've never seen somebody try to avoid this. I don't even think you should fully avoid it, but you should very carefully tread in there and understand where you're making mistakes. Are you making safe bolt-ons to the side of something? Or are you doing deep core changes to that thing that impact both sides of the business? I remember in one organization, we had to really hit the emergency brake on something. So we had an organization that was used to having complete freedom to changing their software. It was their own startup, their own SaaS. They had their own way of doing things. They could ship code every day. And they were going full speed into the wrong approach to selling to another customer in another market. But the way it was being done and the way the concepts were modeled would have essentially trapped and held hostage all changes to being approved by another company. And because of the contract agreements, that other company would have to be retrained on every single change to the system. These little traps come in and they block things up, and now you have a jumbled up conceptual model. And you say, well, is this North Star, mission A or mission B code? And a lot of the time, those things are divergent, but packed into the same space undeservingly. And that creates another back pressure. Back to the architecture, where your architecture is not accommodating these things correctly and it's limping along. And so you look at some piece of code and you say, is this thing serving A or B? And it's like, well, sometimes it's A, sometimes it's B. And you never get a clear answer from anyone. And if you do, it's going to be very different from the answer you get from a neighboring team or even the same team on a different module in that team's ownership. You just end up with a limping along architecture that barely serves anything. And the architecture was already misleading to begin with. And that precipitates back into making the code try to do more than it ever meant to do. And that means, we're going to add in more hacks, more workarounds. And it's a miracle any of this stuff works. It's all jerry-rigged together. We don't know what's going on. We can't explain the code. There's outages every day, sure, but we keep it working somehow. And then somebody knocks on your door and they say, okay, why is performance so bad? They don't mean the website performance. I'm sure at this stage, the web performance is really bad. And they say, why is the performance so bad? What they're actually talking about is the team performance. Why is it that we can't move our North Star? Why is it we can't execute on these missions? Why does it take so long for me to get features out of dev and product? Why can't we change our conceptual models to accommodate our business model? Why is it so hard? Why is everything so locked in? And again, it's because we did not accommodate the back pressure from that initial problem space, right? The planned code will take longer than anticipated. Now, I understand it doesn't always lead into the situation I described. And initially, it will almost never lead into that situation I described. This is not a one-off maneuver. This is something that happens over a protracted time period, over months, many code changes from many people for many different reasons. It adds up, right? So at some point it adds up, and it doesn't always lead to hacks and workarounds, right? There are a lot of times when the team comes together and they find a really clever way that's completely a great idea, works well with the architecture standards, works well with the conceptual model, and it was just something that was overlooked. This happens. The thing is, we need to think about this from a statistical model. That is not a strategy that you can hope for happening 90% of the time. That is a strategy that happens probably 20% of the time. Maybe you can coach your team to get really clever, really creative at that. Maybe you can make your architecture so hyper flexible that it even gets you an extra 10% out of that. But if you scale together all those percentages and you multiply it and multiply those percentages, you are guaranteeing the failure. So you need to accommodate something like this. You can actually change one of these variables in the system, right? We only looked at a frozen plan. So you have this back pressure decay, small pressures that slowly build up into these really big problems due to inaction or unwillingness to change things for the right reasons. And that's the important part, is changing these things for the right reasons. There are many times where you should not change that plan, but there's also many times where you shouldn't change the code. There's many times where you shouldn't change something else. But as much as that's true, chances are you actually need to make an accommodation to both sides of that equation in order to alleviate the back pressure and redirect it somewhere else, so that the back pressure does not create decay through your system, so that the back pressure does not cause decay through your whole socio-technical system that is your company, right? That's the code to the mission, including the people, the architecture, the product, the whole thing's connected, and it ends up decaying if you let it push back enough. And like I said, the system is not brittle, right? It's not like the first few violations will cause this huge mountain out of a molehill. No, this is the protracted problem over years of not doing the right thing to alleviate that back pressure, to make sure the other things in the system are held up to the right standards and the right quality, to accommodate things the right way. And it's very, very easy to fall into this trap, right? Because not doing anything, right, taking inaction to this problem at the beginning is actually rewarded by the system itself. It's saying, well, we're going to fix the plan and we still got results. And I got a reward for that because I got a result. Your brain is reprogramming itself to say, here's an incentive, right? It's an addictive problem, right? So if you are a leader in an organization, you're getting addicted to back pressure decay. So you're going to end up becoming addicted to back pressure decay, and you're going to let that thing rip through the whole company, and you'll end up not accomplishing your mission. And so this is very, very hard to spot, because when you make this mistake, you don't notice the problem instantly. In fact, you get a reward. This is the problem. This is one of the reasons why we so commonly end up in this problem. You should have a lot of sympathy for yourself if you're in this situation, which is figuring out what to do is a very non-linear choice. There's no A or B to this thing. This is beyond shades of gray, right? This is shades of gray plus an imaginary axis through that, because the code doesn't fit the plan. Now what? Should not be, well, we'll just change the plan, because if you do change that plan, you're going to have another back pressure, right? You're going to have to renegotiate customer expectations. You might have marketing collateral downhill from that as well. So you have to think about the knock-on impact of these things and where you're accumulating decay and where you're enforcing those things and where you're creating a situation. And so if you accumulate too much decay, you're going to end up with these problems. And I want you to think about this not in terms of just about changing a plan, even though I started there because that's the most common problem, but this is not the only place that this happens. I'm a big fan of planning. I like to make a plan. Now, I don't think fixed projects are great ideas, but I do think a plan is a great idea. But we saw what happens when you say the plan is sacrosanct. But what happens if I say the code can't be changed? And I've seen that happen, right? And that's like the whole company's working, and let's say we have a low code solution and we can't change the code. We're going to have back pressure in a bunch of places that create issues for us. So you can even see that in companies that have low codified their offering to customers, where the code becomes something that like we really shouldn't change because touching a line of code is very dangerous. But it might be easy for us to do something interesting around the architecture, the org structure, or the conceptual model because of how flexible we've made things. I've seen that happen. And it could be that we say, well, the org structure is locked in. And so we end up with situations where the architecture needs to evolve, but it needs to evolve completely asymmetrically to the org structure that we have. But we refuse to change the org structure. So our code never evolves the right way. And we never build build the right skill sets in the right places, and we don't deepen the right knowledge, or we don't hire the right skill sets into the company. And this is another big risk, right? It's just not bringing in the right people, the right skills to get the change that we need. And this one can actually happen accidentally in a culture that is almost hermetically sealed from good feedback. So, if you saw some of the earlier videos about radical candor, and I will have a video coming up soon about 5 dysfunctions of a team, in companies that are dysfunctional and not giving good feedback, you're almost hermetically sealed from growth, from making the people level changes. And I don't mean changing out people. I mean, making the internal skills, mentality, relationship building changes that need to happen, because that's constantly changing. But if it's not changing in the right place, you're going to have a lot of challenges making changes in other places. And I've even seen one of the most destructive things was the conceptual model of a company was just sealed off completely. This happened due to a blitzscaling impact where we had lots of people who didn't know the system, didn't know the domain, added to the company, and then a flight of people who built that system departed, and not enough knowledge of how that system worked, why it worked the way it did, were put in place. And efforts to build on that were not built around, let's change the model. It was, let's bolt on to the existing model because it seems to work. You seem to think, we nailed it, so let's scale it. But they were scaling into competing missions. This ended up creating problems where they wanted to take on, higher quality of service, deeper levels of automation, and nobody knew how to change that system. And it was actually locked in through the architecture of the system, through the blitzscaling efforts to build as much as we could. The de facto architecture made any of those changes very challenging, which is another thing that can be locked down, is what's our architecture. And I've seen this too, where it's, that's the architecture. We can't change it even when we need to, even when our customers are crying for it. And this creates another type of slowdown. That's another thing that can get locked down and say, that's our sacred thing that can't change in this company. And then a special one on these two here. So I think you have the big mission and then the North Star. And so I think the big mission should be long-term stable. So it should be changeable. But if you're changing this thing as much as you change a plan or change code, you end up rippling too much instability through your company. And the same thing for that North Star, right? That North Star should be stable enough to make a dent in the market, or at least test your major hypothesis about the market. Not on a product level, not on a user activation level, on something very interesting that you're going to see in a balance sheet. And then the other thing is, don't be completely afraid of all back pressure. We're really concerned about is back pressure causing decay through our system. Sometimes back pressure is necessary, and paying attention to it and facilitating the flow of back pressure is very critical. So keep an eye out for that too, right? So if you have a conceptual model and that big hypothesis of how the conceptual model works is proven wrong. So if you think, say, everything needs to be locked down, all the user controls need to be tightly controlled, and you find out through testing like that doesn't work, do not be afraid of that back pressure to say, okay, we need to change the game. We need to change. Our conceptual model has to change, and our North Star that we were tracking, that conceptual model precipitated out of, that needs to change as well. Don't be afraid of that change. Your mission can be the same, but it just means your hypothesis that supports the pursuit of your North Star, that does need to change. So don't be afraid of it everywhere. Be afraid of that unhealthy stuff that's destructive, the stuff that's decaying your system, and it shouldn't be decaying your system. And another kind of interesting back pressure, right? So you see, well, we've accomplished our North Star, right? That grants you permission to go and get a new mission. We've become the dominant market leader in this space. We can afford a second mini mission. We can start experimenting with that. And that is probably at a much later stage than most people are expecting it to be. So that's everything I had to tell you today about back pressure decay in sociotechnical systems. Now you know that whole network is a big sociotechnical network where the big mission can actually influence the code. But if you're not careful, the code can bounce back and force an executive team to say, we're not making progress. We're going to change the mission. We're going to add in missions we don't deserve if you're not careful with it, right? So this is something you need to look for. This is something you need to manage, channel correctly through your organization. Again, that's it. So again, have a great Monday, everybody. If you're new to the channel, don't forget to subscribe so you can see next Monday's video as well. And it's always nice if you give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this. So have a great start in the week, everyone, and take care of that back pressure decay.